Every once in a while, a piece of media comes around that ends up making a permanent mark on the medium, something that sets the standard and becomes the bar that everything else is trying to meet and exceed from then on. These sorts of games are more and more rare nowadays. I can only think of a handful in the last decade or so, but early on in the days of the NES and SNES, these groundbreaking titles happened pretty frequently. There was always something new to build upon, something to fix, something to adjust to make the experience more fun and engaging, and that led to a lot of advancement over a very short period of time. Going through the first two Metroid games has given me a really good look into that advancement. Metroid on the NES invented a genre. It created a game where the world you explore is the main character, and your main goal is to figure out its structure and unravel its secrets. It was revolutionary in a lot of ways, but since it was the first of its kind, made by a very small team with a very tight deadline, it was also very rough around the edges. Metroid 2 was a huge leap forward in so many ways. The gameplay was more engaging and fun, the world design was much more deliberate and thoughtful, and it experimented with in-game storytelling in a way that, while basic by modern standards, was still incredibly effective. However, it was hugely limited by the hardware it was on, and those limitations sculpted the type of experience the game was able to be. That hardware forced the game to somewhat limit the puzzle box world design in favor of something far more linear and easier to navigate, suitable for a handheld device like the Game Boy. But once the Super Nintendo and its competitors were released, developers finally started to see platforms that would let them achieve everything they could have wanted with their experiences. Hardware limitations were largely gone in the 2D design space, and developers big and small could truly start to realize their visions in ways that were frankly impossible prior. Squaresoft released some of their masterpieces like Final Fantasy VI and Super Mario RPG, Capcom took the Mega Man series to the next level with the X sub-series, and of course, Nintendo was going to push their hardware to its limits to create the best versions of their games anyone had ever seen. Super Mario World, Donkey Kong Country, and A Link to the Past all come to mind, but if there was one game that I would consider the best game on the Super Nintendo, it would be Chrono Trigger. But if there was one game by Nintendo I would consider the best game on the Super Nintendo, I'd have a really hard time saying anything other than Super Metroid. Now, this is an opinion that I've changed my mind about a lot over the years. As you may know, I never owned an SNES, so I never had a chance to actually play this game when it was new. I wasn't even really playing games at that point in my life, and because of that, the first exposure to Super Metroid I ever had was well into adulthood. I don't remember exactly when I bought it. I think it was probably sometime in 2010, in preparation for the hot new game Metroid Other M that was definitely going to be great, but I didn't get very far in that first attempt. I only really started to understand it more and finish it at all thanks to a small speedrunning competition me and a few friends had back in the day. A friend of mine chose it as their submission for the competition, and since I didn't want to come in last, I needed to at least know how to beat it, so I did. Long story short, I feel like that wasn't a very good first impression, and it kinda poisoned the well a bit, for lack of a better term. I didn't let the game breathe and allow it to wow me in the way that it probably would have normally, so in the time immediately afterwards, I thought it was just okay. Not a bad game by any means, but it has some quirks that are far more apparent in that particular context that tend to disappear with experience that I didn't have at the time. In more recent years, I've revisited it several times, and I've obviously come away with a much more charitable opinion of it. But even through all of these revisits, there's still so much more to discover, and I'd really like to take this opportunity to truly see all that Super Metroid has to offer. But I do want to come at this game with somewhat fresh eyes, and unlike the first two games, which were quite a bit more of unknown quantities for me, my previous experience can and likely will color my thoughts, so I'm going to try to purposely ignore that experience, and come at this game like someone who had never played it before, at least at first. So let's talk about Super Metroid, and see how Nintendo managed to make a game so evergreen it still stands tall and proud amongst the forest that's grown around it. And just before we get started here, if you like what I do and want to help out, like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you really want to go above and beyond, you can join my Patreon. You'll see these videos a week in advance, get exclusive updates, and even occasionally get an exclusive video. Alright, plug over. Before we get into the actual game here, I want to gush about the intro movie sequence that starts up when you launch the game. Nintendo knew they had something special here, and they wanted the player to realize that right away too. It builds tension really well, there's lots of quick camera moves and cuts until it finally settles on the title screen, showing the baby Metroid Samus had recovered from SR-388 sitting alone in a containment tank crying out. This is such a striking and iconic scene, and it does an amazing job at setting the tone here, because it also shows something has gone incredibly wrong in the Metroid's containment chamber. I mean, how many Nintendo games, even to this day, are willing to show actual bloodied corpses? This was clearly meant to be a much more mature experience than what we'd normally see from them, and they wanted us to know that right away. Once the title screen disappears, we get a gameplay demonstration, but we'll put a pin in that and come back to it later, since it's a lot more important than you'd expect. The game itself opens with one of the most iconic voice lines in gaming history.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Ah, love it. After that, we get another cutscene with Samus giving us some backstory as to what happened up to this point in the Metroid saga. Samus describes her exploits at both Zebes and SR-388, the events that destroyed the Space Pirates base, and found the Federation in possession of the last Metroid. I really like this. I think it works really well as a recap, and I especially like the recreated scenes in Super Metroid sprite art. As someone who played through this game first before finishing either of its predecessors, I feel like it did a good job at getting me up to speed with the gist of the story here. I don't think it quite nailed the emotional impact of finding the Metroid hatchling, but outside of recreating it through gameplay, I don't think that would have even really been possible, so I don't hold that against this scene too much. Anyways, let's get into the game. The space station Samus left the Metroid at is under attack, and obviously Samus is going to go investigate. The atmosphere in this first section is immaculate. There's very little in terms of actual gameplay here. All this section is meant to do mechanically is teach the player how to walk and jump. Nothing else is required. This is purely a narrative sequence meant to set the stage for Super Metroid's plot, and it does it perfectly. Samus makes her way into the room the Metroid hatchling was kept in, and like we saw on the title screen, Samus discovers the scientists are all dead, but what's more concerning is the fact that the baby Metroid is no longer here. Samus makes her way further into the station and finds the hatchling, which seems to remember her, but she finds something else here too. Ridley has returned, and after a fight that Samus likely loses, Ridley decides to destroy the space station and Samus along with it, which triggers an escape sequence. Now, I'll get more into this later on, but this does an amazing job of showcasing the Super Nintendo's graphics tech a ton too. There's a bunch of cool Mode 7 effects here, scrolling backgrounds, sprite scaling, the works. It looks amazing, and it really ramps up the stress of the escape. But of course, this isn't really meant to be a challenge. You have more than enough time to escape even at a leisurely pace. This was all for spectacle, and it creates a great cinematic feel that we'll see time and time again throughout the experience. Anyways, Samus chases after Ridley and finds herself back on planet Zebes, and while it is quite a bit different from Samus's original journey through the planet, there are quite a few things that call directly back to her first adventure. One of the first things you'll do once on Zebes is drop down this long vertical shaft and then head through this room to the right. When I first played through this game, I didn't really like either of these rooms, especially the long vertical shaft. It was easily my least favorite room in the game. They both seemed just so out of place design-wise compared to everything surrounding it. I'm not very observant apparently, as these are both obvious callbacks to Metroid 1's final boss and escape sequence. And I really should have figured that out, because the final boss of Metroid 1 is literally shown in this game's opening cutscene, but until going through these games for my videos, I just never put the two pieces together. I'm dumb. Looking back on them with the context of the previous games now, it is so cool that they put them here. Like, we're literally traversing through places that Samus has already been, through the very room we destroyed the Space Pirates leader in just a few years prior, effectively doing a victory lap through Samus's accomplishments, but it doesn't directly call attention to it or actively revel in the nostalgia. A lesser game would have probably had a flashback as soon as you entered Mother Brain's room, but Super Metroid shows a lot of restraint here. If you don't notice the importance of these rooms, like I didn't, they're just rooms. At least until you head down the elevator just at the end of the hall here. Yeah, I knew exactly exactly what this room was, and since I knew about it, I immediately headed to the left to pick up the morph ball upgrade. But this is where things start to get really clever. This little trip down memory lane wasn't just for show, it was to lure the player into a false sense of security. Nothing has happened so far, which makes sense, as the space pirates were apparently wiped out, but when you grab the morph ball, a security camera turns on and locks its gaze onto Samus. Something else is here, and it knows that you are too. Heading to the right gives us our first missile upgrade from our first Chozo statue, something we've seen a lot throughout the past few games, and upon heading back up the elevator, Samus is ambushed by space pirates, which she quickly defeats. Now, we're only a few minutes in, and the game has already done a ton to surprise us and subvert our expectations, but it's going to do one more thing in this first zone to keep us on our toes. Heading back up to the surface, Samus uses her morph ball to reach another new area where another Chozo statue rests. However, upon grabbing the morph ball bomb, the door locks and the Chozo statue springs to life and attacks. Now again, this is not meant to be super challenging or anything, it's instead another early example of Super Metroid taking something we thought we knew and twisting it around in order to surprise us. With the statue defeated and the morph ball bomb power-up gained, this is effectively the end of the game's tutorial, and Samus can freely head deeper into the depths of Zebes. Now, it's far from done with teaching. There's a famous room early on that won't let you progress until you learn how to use the run button, but outside of a few specific things, Super Metroid takes a relatively loose approach to tutorializing, letting the player come across and master new abilities or techniques of their own volition. The reins are very loose here, and as someone who loves being able to explore and discover new things on my own in games, this is great. There are loads of things that Samus can do that aren't explicitly stated anywhere, or are only mentioned in the game's control options. Just as an aside, I adore that this exists. Too often, even today, we get games from Nintendo that don't allow for proper control customization. Sure, things are tested to make sure that they're mostly fine for most people, but nothing is going to work for everyone, and giving us the option to make wonky control schemes of our own goes a long way to making the experience of playing a game more enjoyable for everyone. That being said, when I went into this game, I wanted to have a more authentic experience, so rather than taking a modern controller and then mapping all the commands as I want, I went out and got this guy, and I'm using the default controls from the game. My opinions are mixed. Like, yeah, it's kind of a miracle that they were able to fit everything onto this controller, but man, does this setup leave things to be desired. First is how things are mapped to the face buttons. The shoulders are mapped to have Samus aim up and down, which does make some intuitive sense, but that leaves most of her other actions smushed together in a way that can only be easily controlled one at a time by your thumb. Like, sure, I guess it is possible to hold a charge beam, run, and maneuver with jumps all at once with just your thumb, but it never really managed to click for me. A controller with a second full pair of shoulder buttons solves this completely, but we wouldn't get that from Nintendo until the Wii era, so I can't exactly hold that against the game too much. It did what it could with what it had. My next issue is a little bit more difficult to solve, and that's because of how it handles Samus's upgrades. When you get your missiles, you select them with the select button, and then you can fire away as you like. Not a big fan, honestly. The select button is pretty awkwardly placed, which makes it inconvenient to actually use. It's not that big of a deal if it's just missiles, but as you progress through the game, you start to get more abilities that are selected the same way, and Super Metroid's solution to selecting things is cycling through what you have one at a time, with the ability to snap back to the regular beam with Y. Again, I'm not really saying there were many better options. Those were literally the only two buttons left that could have these functions, but I don't know, it just doesn't feel great. It is a little bit better with cycling on Y and the reset on select, but yeah. Ultimately, I feel like the control scheme here is a little rough around the edges and doesn't allow for the most optimal set of controls, but again, it all had to fit on this, and they managed to pull it off pretty well, so good job. Anyways, before heading into Brinstar, if we head to the right, we'll see this big golden statue with 4 space pirate bosses on it, and I guess that gives us our primary goal here. We need to defeat the 4 bosses to unlock a final zone, another nice callback to the original Metroid. Heading down an elevator brings us into Brinstar, and we finally get a chance to start exploring and having that Metroid experience again. The first thing you'll probably notice here if you play the NES version of Metroid is how different different this version of Brinstar is compared to that game's. NES Brinstar was largely a rocky area. Sure, it had one section with a bit of greenery, but it was largely blue or yellow caverns. Super Metroid Brinstar, on the other hand, is incredibly lush, full of life, and varied. There's sections where it's completely overgrown with vines, sections where it seems like fungal spores have outcompeted the other natural flora, and despite feeling so new, it still manages to retain some of that original game's identity. Like, it still has rocky corridors that feel like the ones from that first game, and of course, that first section where we got the Morph Ball is right out of the NES Metroid's Brinstar. Brinstar really makes an incredible first impression. Criteria does a good job of giving us a taste as to what we're going to be expecting with this game, but Brinstar is really when we can start to truly understand the scope and scale of this project. Everything is built and designed with so much care and attention, with a huge emphasis on novelty. Repeated rooms were a huge issue with the first game, and popped up here and there in Metroid 2 as well, but Super Metroid is so confident in what it's doing that it basically never feels the need to repeat itself. Every new room is a new experience with different layouts, enemies, and obstacles, and this will be a constant throughout the entire game, but it really stands out in Brinstar in contrast to what came before. Making our way into Brinstar, this first vertical shaft already has a ton to do and a ton to look forward to. There's a bunch of doors that you need to open with missiles that lead to our first missile recharge station, our first map room, we'll come back to that in just a bit, a missile upgrade, but most importantly, a pretty obvious path we can't traverse yet, and a challenge we can't pass yet. I love that the game threw both of these at the player so quickly. Many of Super Metroid's secrets are really well hidden. We've already passed by several of them and we may have never known. In fact, remember the energy tank at the start of the first game? Well, it's in the exact same spot in this game, but you'd need that previous experience to even clue in that this may be a possibility. These, on the other hand, are really obvious and out in the open, and make for great anchor points when we eventually want to retrace our steps later in the game. But what's particularly important in my mind is that the game purposefully only puts one of each here. It introduces these ability locked challenges and paths, but it does its best to not overwhelm the player right away. There's only one path forward at this point. Super Metroid will eventually break wide open, letting the player do basically whatever they want, but it needs to make sure that we're prepared for that first. The next main room opens things up a bit more, introducing a new type of door that we can't open, a new block type that we can't interact with yet, the charge beam, a staple of Samus's arsenal from here on out, and the game's first real mini-boss, Spore Spawn. I really don't have much to say about Spore Spawn itself. It's kinda just boring as a fight. It just moves around the room every once in a while, opening up so Samus can shoot it with a missile. As the fight progresses and it gets closer to dying, its color darkens and it speeds up, showing its increasing desperation. Eventually, it goes down and Samus is rewarded with the super missile upgrade for her trouble. This is another one of Samus's staple upgrades from this game, and with this, we can now open these green doors that let Samus travel further into the world. I guess on the subject of combat, I don't think I'd ever say that it's what I'd consider one of the Metroid series' strengths, and yeah, Super Metroid is no different here. It's quite a bit better than the previous games, largely due to Samus being quite a bit more mobile and capable than she previously was, but I still wouldn't say that the combat here is amazing. It's perfectly serviceable as a way to add challenge to the game as a whole, and some of the bosses here are pretty awesome, but I'd never really think of fighting any of the regular enemies as particularly fun parts of the experience. Again, they're fine, but most enemies have very simple movement and attack patterns and are really never much of a threat. Super Metroid is by far the easiest game in the series so far, and the combat's lack of bite is a big reason for that. Now, eventually, Samus makes her way into Norfair, and this is another example of Super Metroid subtly teaching the player something incredibly important that they'll need to be aware of in order to get the most out of the experience. In order to reach Norfair, Samus has to fall down the red tower, which at this point is a one-way trip. There's no way out once you drop down, and Norfair itself is incredibly hostile and limits where Samus can go. You can get the high jump boots upgrade here, but beyond that is just roadblock after roadblock, largely due to the intense heat of some of these areas. This is where it's important to have found the map room back in Brinstar. There's no obvious path forwards, but the map shows a series of rooms beyond a solid wall in the elevator room, and if you experiment, you'll be able to discover these hidden blocks destroyable by super missiles, which lets you progress. The map is an incredibly useful tool, and it's genius how they implemented it for the most part. The map rooms only give you a vague layout of the area, their general shape represented by squares. But it very cleverly leaves a lot of the side paths and hidden rooms blank, which really gives the feeling of forging a new path through uncharted wilderness, where no one knows what you'll find. Now, even these hidden areas aren't always completely unmarked. The map will often show particularly important places of interest, just not how to get to them, and I think that only makes me want to explore and find these hidden areas even more. But I do have one complaint with the map that frustrated me a ton during my playthroughs for this video, and it has to do with how it shows items. The map's design doesn't give nearly enough information to properly convey all the different situations you can come across when it comes to items. For instance, if you see an item in the world, you would expect that it would show up on the map, correct? I certainly would, and thankfully they do, except for when they don't. Yeah, for some reason the map is only programmed to show items on the map screen when the item in the world is placed on a pedestal. That means any items just placed out in the world or hidden in single blocks, like the Criteria energy tank for instance, will never show up on the map regardless of whether or not you've seen it or even collected it. Beyond that, Super Metroid has several rooms that contain more than one item, and again, there is no way to know about that looking at the map, and while that does get somewhat remedied later on with a few upgrades, specifically the X-ray scope, which can reveal hidden invisible paths and hidden items, the map can make collecting items, especially in the end game, a lot more tedious than it could have been. But what really gets me is the fact that a found item and a collected item are shown the exact same way on the map. This ended up being a big problem for me because I wanted to go for 100% item collection, which is tracked for the first time here, but I ended up missing one item. I checked for a long time, like well over an hour, scouring the map for the one item I may have missed, thinking it must have been something hidden that I just blanked on or didn't notice. But no, it turns out the item I missed was just completely out in the open. I just never went back to find it because the map showed a pink square with a white dot, which in every other instance in my experience meant an item that I had found and collected. And you want to know what item it was? It was this one. Yeah, it seems like the sort of thing that would be impossible to miss, right? But the way I was playing, I found the item from a side I couldn't reach initially, and out of pure serendipity, I explored in just the right way to make it look like I had collected the item while never actually going there. All they needed to do was have a different symbol or color for a room with an item that hadn't been collected, and this issue would have never come up. Heck, that would probably solve the multiple item room issue as well. Just show that other symbol or color until all the items in that area are collected. Boom, that one change and the map is effectively perfect. Now, to be clear, my experience is largely user error, but it is user error that snowballed into a nightmare because the map's legend isn't robust enough to properly portray all the different types of information you may need. Anyways, with the map tangent out of the way, let's head into the new area in Brinstar and see what's there. Immediately beyond the super missile wall is this foreboding bit of architecture, which probably indicates something important here, and upon exploring we come across the game's first major boss, Kraid. Kraid wasn't all that intimidating in Metroid. He was super short and stubby and didn't really put up all that much of a fight, in contrast to the manual's art of him at least. But Super Metroid aimed to remedy that embarrassing portrayal. Upon entering the room, Kraid emerges from the ground already pretty big, but once you do enough damage, his real fight begins, and this is incredible. He rises from the ground further, way beyond Samus's reach, and the fight continues on a few small platforms high in the air. Kraid himself is still not a particularly difficult fight. It's another wait for the opening then shoot missiles affair, but it's quite a bit more frantic since he's constantly tossing claws and shooting spikes out of his chest at Samus. It's an incredible reimagination of the fight from that original game, and it really does Kraid a ton of justice. Once he eventually does go down, Samus is rewarded with the Varia suit, which will finally let her weather the fires of Norfair, and the game really starts to open up in a big way from here on out. To kick off this second phase of the game, after a little bit of exploring around Norfair, Super Metroid awards us with arguably the second most iconic ability in the entire series, the Speed Booster. I can't really stress enough how much this changes the feel of Metroid as a series. In the previous entries, Samus was at best slow and methodically controlled, and at worst was lumbering and tedious, but the Speed Booster changes that in so many ways. Just on its own, going fast is fun, but on top of speed, the Speed Booster really emphasizes how powerful it's making Samus. When she's up to speed, she just barrels through everything, enemies, attacks, blocks, and that's not even the half of it. But to go over the other half, we're gonna need to take a quick detour. After we find the speed booster, we can use it to head through this corridor, which conveniently uncovers a new type of block for us, a clear signal to return to this later, then grab the ice beam which returns yet again, and with it can climb up the red tower back up to the surface, grabbing power bombs along the way. Now I'm sure many of you may be wondering why I haven't talked much about Samus's movement aside from the basic running and jumping up till now, and that's because yet again, Super Metroid holds its cards close to its chest in an attempt to surprise the player. Upon making our way back up to the surface, with the way to the right effectively blocked, Super Metroid primes us for a second loop through Brinstar, which is really genius. While yeah, we are going through many areas we've already explored, the game has, as we've already seen, done a great job of showing off things that we weren't able to reach prior, and with our new set of abilities gained, are now able to properly explore. And through this exploration, Super Metroid is about to introduce two things that completely change the game. The first of which is found down here by using a power bomb to open up this path we couldn't go down prior. Down here, on top of another fun little reference to the first game, we come across these aliens which don't seem to be hostile towards Samus at all. They teach Samus the wall jump. Wall jumping is arguably the most powerful ability Samus has in this game, and what's so cool about how this was introduced is that this isn't a power-up. You don't come across a wall jump core or sticky pads or whatever to give you the ability to wall jump. Samus has always had that ability, but unless you already know that, you may never figure it out since it's never necessary. And yeah, this is never mentioned anywhere in the game before this point. It's not even mentioned in the manual, which is particularly sneaky because the manual does spoil all of the other main abilities Samus is going to get. It's just the wall jump that's kept secret until you find it in-game. I seriously can't even think of a game with a better reward for exploration than this. Seriously, the wall jump is going to change how you play Super Metroid forever. Wall jumping itself can be pretty finicky, the timing is a little tight and the rhythm for it can be tough to figure out, but it feels so good to do, and once you learn how it wants you to do it, you can get pretty quick with them, jumping up individual walls and getting to places you weren't meant to otherwise. For instance, remember the entrance to Kraid's lair? What the game wants you to do is what I originally did. Head down into Norfair to grab the high jump boots, which makes for an easy hop up into it. But if you know about the wall jump, you can do this little maneuver to get here without ever entering Norfair. And the game is full of things like this. There are countless rooms that make you think you need a certain ability to traverse, but then you can just use the wall jump or bomb jump or whatever to carve your own path. And I think the second ability we find in our victory lap through Brinstar also does this incredibly well, the Shine Spark. While moving through Brinstar the second time, you'll likely be using the speed booster, and if you run with it through this section, you'll find yourself falling where you meet another friendly alien, which teaches us how to use the Shine Spark. By crouching when running at your top speed, you'll store all that energy, and by pressing jump, you'll shoot up at great speed, destroying any destructible blocks in your path at the cost of some HP. This secondary effect from the speed booster is another one of Samus's most iconic abilities, and while I do love it, I do have a few issues with how it's implemented in this first game. My first issue is that it's a little tricky to actually pull off in the way that you want to sometimes. You can only Shine Spark in 3 directions here: directly up, diagonally forward, and directly forward. Directly up is easy, just hit the jump button while standing, and diagonally up is just as easy. It's the same thing while aiming up with your cannon. But going forward is quite a bit more difficult, and it's something I still haven't 100% figured out. So I think you have to be facing the direction you want to go, jump forward, do a quarter circle movement from up to forward, and then press jump again to do the spark. I do understand the necessity to be in the air for this to work, kinda, but it seems a little convoluted to me. If I were designing this ability, I'd make it a little easier. Simply with a charged spark, jump into the air, and whatever direction you press, forward or backward, another A press is where you go. But arguably the most, I guess, disappointing aspect for this, if anything can be disappointing for such a game-changing, series-defining ability, is the fact that there really aren't that many puzzles built around the Shine Spark itself. There are a few, but they never really get any more complicated than charge a spark, then press A in the right spot. It's still an incredibly fun movement ability that lets you bypass plenty of challenges and even abilities, but you can tell that its inclusion was a little more ancillary and wasn't meant to be one of Samus's primary tools yet. This is something that later games will capitalize on a ton, but it's not quite there in this first appearance. And there's even more obscure abilities here that the game never properly explains in any way, just showcases their existence. Remember the gameplay demo that plays at the very beginning of the game? Well, that's largely to key the player into a few of Samus's most hidden abilities. For instance, it shows that the Shine Spark exists, giving us our only clue into the location of this series of hidden rooms. It shows off the bomb jump and some tech with the grapple beam, which we'll get into a bit later. But most interestingly are the two abilities it shows off last. These are special item combo abilities that can only be done under certain circumstances, and not only do I love that they were included, I love how they were included. Like I said, there's nothing in or outside the game explicitly explaining how these are done. The only hint we have are these gameplay demos, but frankly, I think that was enough. For instance, the Crystal Flash. The demo gives you all the information you need to figure out how to do it. It shows that you need to be at low HP and you need to have a certain number of super missiles and power bombs. It's simply a matter of figuring out how to trigger it from that point, and I love the sense of experimentation and discovery that encourages. But yeah, beyond her abilities, Samus's movement in this game is unbelievably polished, nuanced, and fun. Her jump is still fairly floaty, and it uses what came before as its foundation, but it's refined to an incredible degree. Her jump arc is very quick to start, giving you a ton of airtime. You have a variable amount of control, with the standing and spin jumps having different applications, and you obviously have the wall jump to give you a nearly infinite amount of platforming capability. But what I think really makes Samus's jumping feel so good in this game is how the game handled momentum and inertia. In my previous video, I said that these were very important to nailing how a platforming character feels, and Super Metroid is nearly perfect in this regard. Samus has realistic momentum here, letting her jump far longer distances when she's traveling at higher speeds, and she will retain that momentum on her own. But you also have direct control of that momentum. Samus can turn on a dime in the air, which allows for continuous single wall jumps and works wonders for keeping her in control while platforming. It really is some of the best feeling platforming from the era. I really only have one major complaint, which ultimately really doesn't make much of a difference in the grand scheme of things. I kinda wish Samus would have maintained speed after landing from a running jump. As it is, she effectively grinds to a halt the second she lands and has to build up speed again, and I think the movement could have been ever so slightly smoother if she at least maintained her speed to a degree. Anyways, now that Samus is basically fully kitted out with her movement abilities, let's head back into Norfair and keep exploring. I absolutely love what they did with Norfair. It's basically the poster child for what the design philosophy was when rebuilding this world for Super Metroid. It was one of, if not the worst areas in the first game, but not really because there was anything wrong with it conceptually. It was the Molten Lava area, but it mixed in quite a few different little quirks, like the bubble zones, Ridley's lair, etc. All of the ideas that made Norfair interesting has been expanded on to a ridiculous degree, in a way that actually keeps things interesting the whole time. Norfair in the NES game was bloated and convoluted, full of copy-pasted rooms with very little new happening, designed to get the player lost in a way that just isn't any fun. It was my least favorite area in that game. I had effectively no fun exploring it. Super Metroid's Norfair, on the other hand, is an incredibly tightly designed puzzle box that rewards the player for exploring, offers loads of paths through it, especially if you can master the wall jump and get the wave beam early, and is jam-packed full of cool secrets and incredible moments. Obviously, the most famous of these moments is the fight against the game's second mini-boss, Crocomire. Rather than directly killing it, all Samus does to Crocomire is shoot it in order to have it back up, and eventually it moves onto a fragile platform where it falls into the lava. This is a pretty gruesome scene, as you literally see bits of its flesh melt off while it screams in agony in the lava. But that's not even the half of it. You may notice that after it fully falls into the lava, that some air bubbles can be seen moving underground, and once you reach a dead end, the screen locks, the ground shakes, and with a vengeance, Crocomire's living skeleton bursts through the wall. Now, some games may have used this as a second phase for the boss fight, but not here. As soon as it bursts through the wall, it collapses on the ground, dead. This is one of my favorite moments in the game because while, yeah, we don't get a second boss phase here, that wasn't the point. This scene is in its own right a reward for the player. We beat Crocomire and we're rewarded with a thrill. The fear that this thing we killed may be defying death to defeat Samus, only to have the rug pulled from beneath us. I mean, sure, you could consider this to be a little bit less interesting from a gameplay perspective, but I don't care. This was an amazing spectacle, and I love fighting Crocomire so much more than the item we get for beating him. Yeah, just a few rooms beyond Crocomire lies the Grapple Beam, one of the game's new additions, and while I think it is a good addition in the grand scheme of things, I really don't like how it was implemented here. On top of having to select this new movement ability alongside weapons, which is a bit of a pain on its own, I really just think that the Grapple Beam isn't very fun to use. You can latch onto these special grapple blocks and can swing around, or latch onto walls that have them. The main problem I have is that the physics don't feel very good, and the momentum is always a little bit off when swinging and detaching from a grapple point. It's a really ambitious ability. It must have taken a lot of effort to get this working as well as it does, but yeah, it's really not that fun, and I typically do whatever I can to avoid using it whenever possible. Making our way back to the surface, the grapple beam gives us the ability to traverse into the game's third main area, the wrecked ship. I have incredibly mixed feelings about this area. On one hand, thematically and atmospherically, there's a strong argument for the wrecked ship being one of the coolest and lore-densest areas in the entire game. This seems to be a Chozo ship that had crash-landed on Zebes eons ago, since we can find several Chozo statues hidden within it, and in the time since has been taken over by the space pirates to use as a makeshift laboratory. And when we first enter it, it's eerie. The lights are all off, the doors don't work, and while exploring, Samus is haunted by ghosts. It's super cool, and the doors not working makes things a little more tense when you have to face off against the game's second main boss, Phantoon, because there's no working save station nearby. I don't really have that much to say about Phantoon's fight either. It's fine, but it's also not that interesting. You just dodge its fire and shoot it whenever it materializes until it dies. Things get simultaneously more and less interesting once Phantoon's gone and power returns to the ship. When we start exploring the ship, we start to see some interesting things in the background. Like, look at the screens here. Those look like Metroids to me, so maybe that's why Ridley took the baby Metroid from the Federation, so they could clone the Metroids and recreate the army that Samus destroyed during her first trip to Zebes. Man, the world building and environmental storytelling here is just so well done. That being said, unfortunately, I don't really think the level design in the wrecked ship is nearly as good in comparison, because there really isn't much to it. Wrecked ship is by far the smallest area in the game, and that really does it a big disservice in my eyes. After defeating Phantoon, there's only a handful of rooms left to explore before collecting Samus's final suit upgrade, the gravity suit, and moving on. Actually, I think the fact that the boss is basically the first thing we have to deal with here kind of hurts it too. Once Phantoon is gone, we know that there won't really be anything as challenging or climactic left, so it kind of makes the rooms afterwards feel less important and more like padding. There really is so much more they could have done here to flesh out the ship, expand on the ties to the Chozo, and build on what the space pirates are doing to the Metroids here, but because the ship is so small, there's no real opportunity to do that. It almost feels like this was a very late addition to the game, an area designed to work in some more interconnectivity between some of the other areas, but wasn't really much of a focus on its own. But small pacing issues really start to add up once we leave the wrecked ship and head towards the final main area, Maridia. After picking up the gravity suit, which lets Samus move through water and lava without being slowed down, we can head out the back of the wrecked ship. There's several rooms here which are very large, but there's literally nothing notable in them, not even a single collectible, and that's pretty boring. A word that I'd basically never use to describe Super Metroid otherwise. Trudging through them finally leads us into Maridia, and I have a lot to say about this place. First, I think we'll start with some of the good, because Maridia has a lot of really cool aspects to it. First is the atmosphere. I think that Maridia has the best atmosphere in the entire game. Entering from the top really gives you a good grasp of how vast it is meant to feel. You start on the surface on what seems like a series of beaches surrounded by overgrowth. With nowhere else to go, you have to head down through this tunnel, which teases something interesting. That looks like a Metroid, but it's also wrong. Maybe the space pirates have been discarding their failed Metroid clones here? Anyways, this tunnel is pretty genius because it takes you down directly to the lowest levels of Maridia, and you have to find your way back up from the bottom. You have to use a power bomb to destroy this glass tunnel, something the game hints at just a few minutes prior. This is something else you can use to change your path through the game in later playthroughs too. Once you get the power bomb, you can enter Maridia even without the gravity suit. Sure, it's slow and not exactly recommended, but I love the fact that the game keeps rewarding knowledge with the ability to exploit that knowledge on future playthroughs, letting the player deepen their own experiences with the world. The lowest levels of Maridia really emphasize the atmosphere. It's full of weird landscapes, unique enemies, and animals. It sells the idea of a person exploring the depths of the ocean extremely well. It has that sort of otherworldly feel that is very unique to it, even on this alien planet. The water distortion effects on the screen when underwater does a lot to amplify that feeling as well. After exploring a bit, we enter this purple zone and finally come across the space pirates' scientific achievements, or failures depending on your perspective, the Metroids. These are indeed failed clones of the Metroids that act very similarly. They still try to drain life energy from Samus, but they're much weaker. They have a hard time latching onto her, and she can destroy them with her beam alone, something that a full-fledged Metroid would be able to just shrug off. In the next room, we come across the game's third mini-boss, Botwoon, and this is another just kind of okay fight. You shoot him in the face until he explodes, the end. Now, you may have noticed that we've gone through a lot of this area and haven't come across a single new ability, and that's because there's only one mandatory ability in this entire area. It's by far the driest area for upgrades in the entire game. That isn't necessarily a problem. Samus is extremely capable by now, so there really isn't that much more she can get that would meaningfully improve her kit. However, I did end up feeling that lack of progression, and Maridia ends up dragging quite a bit. While it isn't the largest area in the game, that award goes easily to Norfair. Maridia is just chock full of rooms that don't really have any purpose, or are way too big just for the sake of being really big. Like, the room with Metroids just before finding Dragon could have been cut down by like 2 whole squares and lost absolutely nothing of value. I wish there was a bit more of a level design balance between the wrecked ship and Maridia. I feel like both of these areas would flow a lot more smoothly if the wrecked ship was expanded on a bit and Maridia was condensed. As it is, Maridia is designed in a way that leads to a lot of unnecessary bloat. Like, if we wanted to collect the items from these 2 rooms, we first have to get to this room, drop down this sand pit, and collect the items from one side. Then we have to do a loop of like 50% of the zone just to drop down the opposite side of the same sand pit to collect more items. Come on, man, just take one of these pits out and stick these 2 items in the rooms behind the wrecked ship. These design choices are all over Maridia, and it drags the game's pacing a lot. One of the worst examples is the Spring Ball. Yeah, Spring Ball returns as an upgrade here, but it feels incredibly out of place with Samus's current kit. It made a lot of sense in Metroid 2, since Samus had to rely on the Spider Ball for a majority of her vertical movement, but here, with Samus's movement being so unbelievably versatile, there really isn't much room for the Spring Ball to carve a niche for itself. But one of the worst things about the Spring Ball is actually getting it. You have to find your way into this hidden cavern, which is pretty cool, but then you just have to sit here and watch this robot slowly break sand blocks apart for like an entire minute just for Samus to then make her way to the Spring Ball. This is really tedious, and it's particularly strange to me because Samus could shoot through blocks of sand in Metroid 2 and tear through them with the plasma beam. What would have been cool and a really nice nod to Metroid 2 is if Samus got the plasma beam before entering this room, she could just tear through these blocks of sand on her own rather than waiting for the robot to do it for her, but whatever. Anyways, speaking of Plasma Beam, in order to actually get it, we need to defeat Dragon, so let's do that. This is a really cool fight, one of my favorites in the game because it gives you a few ways to tackle it. Obviously, you could fight it as intended, which offers a good challenge, but Dragon also offers the series' second intended quick kill option. There's these turrets on the walls here, and if you break them open, electricity arcs through them. If you then get grabbed by Dragon and use the grapple beam on the exposed current, both Dragon and Samus get damaged, quickly leading to Dragon's death. This is so incredibly cool. Again, rewarding experimentation with a quicker way to defeat one of the game's main bosses. Upon defeating Dragon, we are rewarded with the space jump, and with it gained and Plasma Beam grabbed along the way, there's only one place left to go, so let's head back towards Norfair. But before we do, I need to talk about Super Metroid's presentation as a whole here because it does so much to elevate the experience. Super Metroid tries to create a much more cinematic experience than the first two games, and the music is one of the main ways it achieves that goal. More than ever, it knows exactly when to use its music to emphasize an environment or create an emotional response to an event. I talked a bunch about how great Maridia's atmosphere is, and man, the music is one of the biggest contributors to how it feels, especially in the underwater sections. Seriously, this soundtrack is so good. It manages to keep a lot of the same atmospheric ambient feel that the previous games went for, but it ends up overall feeling quite a bit more melodic than what we heard from the previous games, and goes for an appropriate level of bombast when it's needed. Norfair had basically the biggest glow up ever. The NES versions fit the zone very well, however, you probably wouldn't put it on a playlist or anything. This version not only manages to serve its purpose in creating that vibe, it's also a straight up banger that cemented itself as one of the most iconic themes in the series. The music, the sound design is also incredible. From the shots of Samus's beams, to the sounds of the wildlife on Zebes, to the screams of the space pirate bosses as Samus fights them, it's all so well designed and lush, it helps make the world feel so vibrant and alive. And of course, the game's incredible sprite work helps out with that immensely. I mean, I shouldn't really have to say much about this, right? You've been seeing how this game looks like for the last 40 minutes or so, you know how good it looks. Backgrounds and environments are so incredibly detailed and impeccably designed. Each area has multiple different tile sets to increase the variety in their designs a ton. Mode 7 is used brilliantly for effect in cutscenes, and of course enemy and character sprites are some of the best on the system hands down. Just look at these sprites, they're so good. I can only imagine how amazing they looked on a proper CRT back in the day when they still hold up so well on digital displays. And with that, we're starting to get close to the end now, so let's head back into the depths of Norfair, track down Ridley, and find that baby Metroid. Man, Lower Norfair is such a cool area. It's got this ancient temple vibe, and it seems to me at least like it's where the Chozo built the majority of their civilization on Zebes after their ship landed on the planet. They're obviously long gone, Ridley has taken over the area and made it his own lair, and it's full of traps, space pirate ambushes, and other surprises for Samus. The first one happens in this room, where a second Terizo statue comes to life and attacks, but it's way more dangerous than the first one. It does loads of damage, has a bunch of health, and even snatches your super missiles out of the air to toss back at you. Now at this point, Samus is basically unkillable. I was really never in any danger of dying, but I imagine if you enter this fight without a ton of resources, it could be pretty challenging. Defeating it rewards us with the screw attack, making Samus even more unstoppable, and now that we're all kitted out, I'd like to finally point out the Samus screen in the menu because it's really interesting. In most games, once you've got an upgrade, you've just got it, and there's no real reason to want to deactivate it. That's basically true here too, but again, in the spirit of giving the player as many options and ways to play as they can, the developers created this menu where you can go in and activate or deactivate Samus's upgrades whenever you'd like, including stuff like your suit upgrades or basic abilities like the Morph Ball. Again, there's very little reason to do this, I kinda just think it's neat. Now, you do need to do this in order to activate some of the beam combos, but aside from that, it's really just for fun. Making our way into Ridley's lair, we come across some incredibly dangerous space pirates that are only vulnerable after their dive kick, and a few minutes later, we finally face off against the one who started this all, Ridley. Ridley is easily the most difficult fight in the entire game, and even when you have a lot of resources, it can get pretty dicey. He flies around the room in a way that's really hard to predict, hits like a truck, and his moves are super threatening. Man, we've come a long way since 1987. Anyways, eventually he does go down, down, and we make our way into the room beyond him to find the container the Metroid was kept in, except it's been shattered, with the baby Metroid nowhere to be found. I'm sure there's nothing to worry about with that at all, so with Ridley defeated, there's only one thing left to do. Let's head back to the statue in Crateria and see what lies beneath it. So up until this point, we've kinda got little bits and pieces of the story here. Environmental clues as to what the space pirates had been up to, and if you're paying attention you can clue into what's going on. However, even if you're not, once we descend down into Turian, we get it spelled out pretty obviously. What we find down here are full-blown Metroids, and while yes, this is another reference to the first game, the narrative context here is completely different. In that game, the space pirates had captured the Metroids and were going to use them as a weapon to take over the galaxy, but it's a lot more personal here. The space pirates have finally successfully cloned the last Metroid, and while we didn't really know the extent as to what the space pirates did to the Metroid to achieve these goals, we find out pretty quickly. Samus enters a room where everything, including another Chorizo statue, have been drained of their energy and reduced to dust, and as another enemy enters the screen, a giant Metroid latches onto it and drains it dry. This is what the space pirates have done to the baby Metroid. They've subjected it to horrific experiments that have mutated it beyond recognition. It doesn't even seem to immediately recognize Samus anymore, and it attacks her, at least until it hears the low energy alarm from Samus' suit, which it remembers from the space station where Samus tried to fight and protect it. Struggling with its new nature and the memories it has of the adoptive mother that saved its life, it cries out in confusion and leaves. Pressing on, we come across what's probably the worst room in the game, this save station. We are beyond the point of no return here, so there's no way to get back up to the larger world without restarting the entire game, and if you choose to save here, you're done. The only thing you can do is continue on. This is stupid, and I would have preferred no saving here at all, recreating some of that tension the original game's Turian raid gave, rather than effectively screwing players out of the ability to keep exploring in the end game. If this game is ever remade, I would hope that this station is either removed or the way out of Turian remains open to the very end. Now, to be fair, even if I had chosen to save at this station, I don't think having to replay the game again to collect all the items would be that much of a punishment. Because if you hadn't already pieced it together, Super Metroid is basically one of the most replayable games, like, ever. Throughout the experience, Super Metroid teaches you so many cool little things that can radically affect how you approach the game on second, third, fourth playthroughs, etc. Obviously, the wall jump revolutionizes basically everything, since early access to the wave beam blows the game wide open, but there's also just so many small things that can change how you progress. The openness in the design allows for an inquisitive and brave player to do things that they probably shouldn't, like getting the speed booster before getting the Varia suit, or reaching the wrecked ship before the grapple beam. The world is also filled with these interconnecting paths that tie areas together in ways that don't really matter, but players can use to change how they travel and allow for less backtracking or more efficient item collection. And that's not even talking about all of the amazing stuff that speedrunners have found that shoots the game's replayability into orbit. Things that even many non-speedrunners like myself use to get even more out of Super Metroid. For instance, the Mach Ball is a little trick that lets the player keep their running momentum while in Morph Ball, and that alone does so much. Since that one trick lets you get super missiles early, letting you skip Spore Spawn entirely if you want to, as well as allowing you to get early Ice Beam, letting you head up to the wrecked ship way early, technically even before fighting Kraid if you were really crazy. Even ignoring stuff like Mach Ball, which could be considered a glitch, Super Metroid just has so much respect for the player's intelligence and creativity, letting them forge their own paths through the world they created, and not only allowing it, encouraging it. If I had to bet, I'd put money on the Samus screen existing as it does, purely to facilitate sequence breaking and taking alternate routes through the game. By purposefully programming in a system that lets you turn anything on or off as you wish, you'll never run into a situation where a later power-up unlocks everything you were supposed to get beforehand, or come across a certain combo that wasn't prepared for and just doesn't work. But by making so many of these very specific choices to empower the player to experiment, to wander, to travel off the beaten path, they've created a sort of replayability that just doesn't happen in many other games. Anyways, after choosing to not save in this final save room, Samus presses on, and in this next room, we discover that it's not just Kraid and Ridley from the old space pirates that have come back, but it seems like Mother Brain has been rebuilt as well. Her room is pretty much exactly like it was in Metroid, and I honestly don't really like it much more than I did in that that first game. It's not nearly as frustrating because Samus is just so much more mobile and capable, but it's still just so tedious. But eventually, Mother Brain does go down, the day is saved, and... wait, that didn't happen in the first game. Man, I love this moment, especially with the knowledge of Metroid NES's climax now. The Space Pirates really souped up Mother Brain this time around, knowing a showdown with Samus could happen, and with her giant new body begins the true final battle of Super Metroid. This is a really cool fight in general. She's got some fun attacks and hits incredibly hard, but of course there's a lot more to this fight than meets the eye. Eventually, Samus wears the brain down enough that it has to use its ultimate weapon, a rainbow beam that does 300 damage to Samus and knocks her to her knees. She's so rattled that she can't even get up anymore, it's that devastating. Defeated and unable to save herself, all Samus can do is wait while Mother Brain charges up the blow that will finish her off, when out of nowhere, the baby Metroid rushes into Samus's aid, draining Mother Brain and leaving her for dead. It then, in direct opposition to its nature as an energy vampire, starts to give Samus its own energy. Unfortunately, Mother Brain isn't dead. It recovers from its wounds and starts to attack again, but the Metroid, wanting to protect its mother, keeps giving Samus its energy and shields her from Mother Brain's blows. Eventually, it can't hold on anymore, and with one final blow, the baby Metroid is destroyed. This is a devastating moment. Samus spared this Metroid's life on SR388. She chose to let it live when it was her mission to make sure it didn't, and despite the horrific experiments the Space Pirates did to it, in the end, it remembered that mercy and chose to pay it back tenfold. As the Metroid dies, its body falls onto Samus, and the energy it had absorbed, including Mother Brain's rainbow beam, is absorbed by Samus. With the Metroid's power at her command, Samus stands up, ready to finish off Mother Brain once and for all. Mechanically, this second phase of the fight is really just a formality. Mother Brain can't do anything to you anymore. Samus's rainbow beam tears through her, staggering her with every blast, to the point that she can't even fight back. But that's exactly what I want to be feeling right now. I want to destroy Mother Brain for what it did to the baby Metroid, and it's so cathartic to use the Metroid's own power to achieve that goal. This fight is purely for spectacle, a cinematic conclusion to the conflict between Samus and Mother Brain, and it feels so good to take her down. A few short minutes later, Mother Brain is destroyed, decaying into nothing as she should, but the Space Pirates have one more trick up their sleeves. Like the first game, a self-destruct protocol is activated once Mother Brain dies, attempting to take Samus with the doomed planet. It's a fun, if relatively easy escape sequence. Much like the Sarah's Station escape at the beginning, this is meant to get your blood pumping but isn't expected to kill you. That would just be cruel. Interestingly, if you head into the room where you got the Morph Ball bombs at the start, you can find the aliens that taught the wall jump and shine spark and can free them, allowing them to escape the planet before it blows, as shown in the ending cutscene. And that was Super Metroid. Man, this game really is a masterpiece. Everything was designed with so much care, attention, and consideration for the player's experience. The previous two games always had some caveats to the player experience. The first game was clunky and unpolished, and Metroid 2's Game Boy restrictions are pretty self-evident, but Super Metroid finally allowed the Metroid team to run wild, do everything they could have wanted with this series. They pushed boundaries in so many ways with level design, sound design, atmosphere, and the cinematic experience offered by the gaming medium. And don't even get me started on how they push the boundaries with player expression and experimentation. They really let the player get away with pretty much whatever they want. If you can find a way to get somewhere, to do something, the game just runs with it and lets you forge your own path through the world. And really, I think this is what truly sets Super Metroid apart, and makes it one of the best and most important games ever made. Metroid on the NES may have invented the genre, but Super Metroid perfected it and became the true blueprint for everything that came afterwards. Not every game in the Metroidvania subgenre has taken directly from that original game, but they pretty much all have Super Metroid's DNA. This game truly has a level of influence that almost nothing else manages to reach, and it's so impressive that it manages to be that common ancestor, yet outside of a few small quirks like the map and the control scheme, feels just as evolved and modern as the games that were released decades later. That's not to say that it's perfect or anything, it definitely isn't. The control scheme is a little wonky, very cramped on the SNES controller, some of the upgrades aren't all that fun to use, particularly the grapple beam, and I wouldn't wouldn't say that the combat is all that engaging on its own, but the biggest issue I have here is the lack of balance between the wrecked ship and Maridia. Condensing Maridia and expanding the wrecked ship while adding some points of interest in the area between them would do a lot to fix the pacing of those two zones and make them both flow so much better. That being said, these are all ultimately very small gripes that don't hurt the experience all that much. Super Metroid is an incredible game that I can go back to whenever I get the Metroidvania itch and have an amazing time. It really is an act that will be impossible to follow, but 8 years later, Nintendo were planning on doing just that. And what they decided to do was basically not even try to bottle this same lightning. They decided to twist everything we knew of the Metroid series on its head, and we'll see how that turns out in the next video. Thank you all so much for watching. And just before I end the video, I want to thank my amazing paid Patreon members, R.A. Miller, Luigi, Lucky Wonderfish, Creeping Briar, Matthew Lorigan, Dom, Benjamin Illiff, and Anthony. You're all the best. Thank you so much.